written in the same reconstructed narrative style inspired by the kinds of civil disputes commonly featured on the series rather than a verified transcript, begins with a lawsuit between a homeowner and a swimming pool construction company over an unfinished backyard pool project, defective concrete work, and alleged breaches of contract that left the property unusable for nearly an entire summer. The plaintiff, a physician who recently purchased a large suburban home, explains that he hired the defendant to design and construct an in-ground swimming pool complete with a surrounding patio, decorative lighting, a waterfall feature, and an automated filtration system. According to his testimony, the company presented an impressive portfolio of previous projects and guaranteed completion within 12 weeks, allowing his family to enjoy the pool before the beginning of the summer vacation season. The plaintiff states that excavation and structural work progressed smoothly during the first month. Heavy equipment arrived on schedule. The excavation was completed, steel reinforcement was installed, and the concrete shell was poured without incident. As construction continued, however, the project began falling significantly behind schedule. Workers frequently failed to appear. Subcontractors blamed one another for delays, and promised completion dates repeatedly passed without meaningful progress. According to the plaintiff, communication became increasingly difficult, with telephone calls often unanswered for days at a time. Months after the agreed completion date, the pool remained partially finished, landscaping had not been restored, and electrical systems necessary for filtration and lighting had not been installed. The plaintiff further explains that after several heavy rainstorms, cracks appeared throughout portions of the surrounding concrete deck. Water collected unevenly near the edge of the pool, creating large puddles that remained for days. Concerned about the quality of the construction, he hired an independent structural engineer who concluded that portions of the concrete deck had been poured without proper expansion joints, and that inadequate ground preparation likely contributed to uneven settling. The engineer also questioned whether drainage around the pool met accepted construction standards. Frustrated by the continuing delays and mounting repair concerns, the plaintiff terminated the contract and hired another contractor to complete and repair the project. He now seeks reimbursement for corrective construction costs, engineering inspection fees, and part of the money already paid under the original contract. The defendant disputes many of the allegations. According to his testimony, the project encountered several unexpected obstacles beyond the company's control. Underground utility lines not identified during the original site survey allegedly required redesign of portions of the plumbing system. Unusually heavy rainfall delayed concrete work, while shortages of specialized pool equipment postponed installation of the filtration and automation systems. The defendant insists that the plaintiff repeatedly requested design changes including additional lighting, expanded patio space, and upgraded decorative stone, which increased both the cost and duration of the project. He also argues that the concrete cracks represent normal shrinkage commonly observed after newly poured concrete cures. Judge Judy immediately requests the written construction agreement together with all approved change orders. The plaintiff produces a comprehensive contract describing project specifications, payment schedules, estimated completion dates, and warranty provisions. Judge Judy carefully reviews the documents before asking whether every design modification was documented in writing. The defendant acknowledges that several changes were discussed verbally without formal written approval. Attention then shifts toward the structural concerns. The plaintiff introduces the independent engineer's report together with photographs documenting cracks in the pool deck, standing water, and sections of uneven concrete. Judge Judy studies the photographs carefully before asking whether the defendant performed any corrective work after the defects were reported. The plaintiff explains that several repair attempts were made but failed to resolve the drainage problems permanently. An experienced structural engineer appears as an expert witness. After reviewing the construction records and inspecting the completed project, he concludes that while some minor concrete cracking is expected, the pattern observed around the pool indicates inadequate joint placement and uneven settling beneath portions of the deck. He further explains that proper grading should have prevented the persistent accumulation of standing water shown in the photographs. Judge Judy asks whether these issues could reasonably have developed solely because of weather conditions. The engineer replies that weather may influence curing, but proper construction techniques should minimize such problems. The defendant responds by presenting progress photographs showing workers installing reinforcement steel, plumbing lines, and concrete forms according to industry standards. He also introduces invoices documenting delays caused by unavailable equipment suppliers. Judge Judy acknowledges that supply shortages can affect construction schedules, but reminds the defendant that such delays do not excuse defective workmanship if the completed work ultimately fails to satisfy reasonable professional standards. Discussion then shifts toward payment. The plaintiff explains that he withheld the final installment only after repeated deadlines passed without completion of the project. The defendant argues that withholding payment prevented him from purchasing the remaining materials needed to finish construction. Judge Judy observes that contractors expecting timely payment must also provide timely performance under their agreements. The plaintiff describes the frustration of watching his backyard remain a construction site throughout the summer while his family canceled gatherings planned around the new pool. Judge Judy expresses sympathy, but explains that damages for disappointment or lost recreational enjoyment are generally more difficult to recover than documented repair expenses. Closing arguments summarize the dispute. The plaintiff argues that he paid for a professionally constructed swimming pool, but instead received months of delays, defective concrete work, and additional expenses required to complete the project. The defendant maintains that unforeseen site conditions, weather delays, and customer-requested modifications largely explain the project's extended timeline and increased costs. Judge Judy carefully reviews the construction contract, engineering reports, expert testimony, invoices, photographs, correspondence, payment records, and warranty documents before announcing her decision. She concludes that although some delays resulted from legitimate external factors, the evidence convincingly demonstrates deficiencies in the concrete deck and drainage system that cannot reasonably be attributed solely to weather or customer changes. The defendant also failed to document significant project modifications adequately, creating unnecessary confusion regarding cost and schedule. Judge Judy awards the plaintiff reimbursement covering the reasonable cost of correcting the defective concrete work, engineering inspection fees, and part of the additional expenses incurred in completing the unfinished construction. However, she declines to reimburse costs associated with optional design upgrades requested by the plaintiff after construction had already begun because those expenses would have existed regardless of the dispute. Before dismissing the parties, Judge Judy offers practical advice to homeowners and contractors. Every construction change should be documented through written change orders describing revised pricing, additional work, and updated completion dates. Contractors should communicate openly whenever delays occur, while homeowners should preserve photographs, inspection reports, and correspondence throughout every major improvement project. The litigants leave the courtroom with mixed reactions. The homeowner recovers much of the money required to repair and complete the swimming pool, while the construction company receives a reminder that professional workmanship and thorough documentation are just as important as technical skill. Judge Judy concludes the case with another practical lesson. A beautiful backyard begins with a solid foundation, and no construction project succeeds without equally solid communication between both sides. Continues with a second case involving a dispute between the owner of a luxury pet boarding facility and the owners of a purebred golden retriever over veterinary expenses, alleged negligence during boarding, and responsibility for injuries the dog suffered while staying at the kennel during the family's 2-week vacation. The plaintiffs, a married couple, explain that they reserved a premium boarding suite for their 5-year-old golden retriever, Bailey, after touring the defendant's facility several weeks before leaving on vacation. According to their testimony, they specifically selected the kennel because it advertised supervised play sessions, climate-controlled accommodations, experienced staff, and on-site monitoring throughout the day. Bailey had always been healthy, friendly with other dogs, and had never experienced any serious medical problems. Before boarding, the plaintiffs completed all required vaccination records, provided detailed feeding instructions, and informed the staff that Bailey occasionally became anxious in unfamiliar environments, but responded well to gentle handling. The plaintiffs state that they received several reassuring text messages and photographs during the first week of boarding showing Bailey playing with other dogs and relaxing comfortably in his suite. Midway through their vacation, however, the defendant contacted them to report that Bailey had developed a slight limp after an outdoor play session. The kennel assured them that staff believed it was only a minor muscle strain and that the dog continued eating normally. Because they were thousands of miles away, the plaintiff relied upon the kennel's judgment and asked to be notified immediately if Bailey's condition worsened. According to the plaintiffs, they were shocked when they returned home to discover Bailey struggling to place weight on his rear leg. Their veterinarian immediately performed X-rays and diagnosed a torn cranial cruciate ligament requiring expensive orthopedic surgery followed by months of rehabilitation. The veterinarian also observed bruising around the injured joint that appeared consistent with a traumatic event rather than a naturally occurring condition. The plaintiffs now seek reimbursement for surgery, medication, rehabilitation therapy, and related veterinary expenses. arguing that Bailey must have been injured because of inadequate supervision while under the defendant's exclusive care. The defendant disputes those allegations. The owner of the boarding facility explains that Bailey participated only in carefully supervised group play sessions with dogs of similar size and temperament. According to her testimony, no staff member witnessed Bailey being attacked, falling from equipment, or suffering any obvious traumatic injury. She argues that ligament injuries sometimes occur naturally while active dogs run or change direction suddenly, even under ideal supervision. The defendant also points out that Bailey showed no signs of severe pain immediately after the incident and continued walking, eating, and interacting with staff until his owners returned. Judge Judy immediately requests the boarding agreement together with the facility's incident reports and daily activity logs. The defendant produces detailed records documenting Bailey's feeding schedule, exercise periods, medication history, and staff observations throughout the stay. Judge Judy reviews the paperwork carefully before asking whether any written incident report was prepared after Bailey first developed the limp. The defendant acknowledges that a brief internal report was completed describing mild lameness observed after outdoor exercise. Attention then shifts toward veterinary evidence. The plaintiffs introduce medical records from their veterinarian together with surgical reports documenting the torn ligament and associated joint damage. Judge Judy asks whether the veterinarian can determine exactly how the injury occurred. The veterinarian appears by deposition and explains that while the injury resulted from significant stress placed upon the knee joint, medical examination alone cannot distinguish between an accident involving another dog and a sudden twisting injury sustained during ordinary activity. The defendant presents surveillance footage from portions of the outdoor exercise yard. Although the cameras do not continuously cover every area, several recordings show Bailey running freely, interacting appropriately with other dogs, and displaying no signs of aggression or rough play. Judge Judy asks whether any footage exists from the precise period during which Bailey first began limping. The defendant explains that the relevant camera angle was temporarily unavailable because maintenance was being performed on the recording system. An experienced canine behavior specialist appears as an expert witness. After reviewing Bailey's veterinary records and the available footage, she testifies that cruciate ligament injuries frequently occur in active dogs during rapid turns, sudden acceleration, or awkward landings while running. Such injuries do not necessarily indicate negligence by caretakers. However, she also emphasizes that boarding facilities must respond promptly whenever an animal begins limping by restricting activity and recommending immediate veterinary evaluation if symptoms persist. The plaintiffs argue that the kennel should have taken Bailey directly to a veterinarian instead of merely observing him overnight. The defendant responds that Bailey continued eating normally, willingly walked back to his suite, and exhibited only mild lameness until shortly before pickup. Judge Judy asks whether the boarding agreement authorized emergency veterinary treatment without first contacting the owners. The defendant points to a clause allowing treatment when staff reasonably believe an emergency exists. Discussion broadens into the responsibilities of professional boarding facilities. Judge Judy explains that businesses entrusted with caring for animals owe duty of reasonable supervision and prompt medical attention when obvious injuries occur. At the same time, they cannot automatically be held responsible for every illness or injury developing during ordinary supervised activity. Closing arguments summarize the dispute. The plaintiffs argue that Bailey entered the kennel healthy and returned requiring major surgery, making the facility responsible for the resulting expenses. The defendant maintains that no evidence demonstrates negligent supervision or misconduct by employees, and that the injury could easily have occurred. Despite appropriate care, Judge Judy carefully reviews the boarding agreement, veterinary records, surveillance footage, activity logs, expert testimony, photographs, and correspondence before delivering her decision. She concludes that the plaintiffs failed to establish by a preponderance of the evidence that Bailey's injury resulted from negligent supervision. The available evidence supports the possibility that the ligament tore during normal canine activity rather than because of preventable misconduct. However, Judge Judy also finds that the facility should have arranged a prompt veterinary examination after Bailey continued limping instead of simply monitoring the condition overnight. Judge Judy orders the defendant to reimburse the plaintiffs for the initial veterinary examination that reasonably should have occurred while Bailey remained under the facility's care, but denies recovery for the much larger surgical expenses because the evidence does not establish that the boarding facility caused the underlying injury. Before dismissing the parties, Judge Judy offers practical advice to both pet owners and boarding facilities. Boarding businesses should document every injury immediately, seek veterinary evaluation whenever lameness persists, and maintain complete surveillance coverage of exercise areas whenever possible. Pet owners, meanwhile, should understand that even healthy animals can suffer orthopedic injuries during vigorous play despite reasonable supervision. The litigants leave the courtroom with mixed emotions. The plaintiffs receive partial reimbursement recognizing the facility's delayed medical response, while the kennel avoids liability for the full cost of Bailey's surgery because negligence was never conclusively proven. Judge Judy concludes the case with another practical observation. Caring for animals means accepting that accidents sometimes happen, but professionalism is measured by how responsibly those accidents are handled once they occur.